The Myth of Jesus with David Fitzgerald.
I want to welcome everybody to the next episode of the Jesus Myth with David Fitzgerald. And again, we have back with us Jonathan Pearce, who is in freeze frame. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully we're going to have another excellent episode of conversation.
I can't stop thinking about everything to do with Ukraine and like everything to do with the politics, the strategy, the war. Like I've turned into a young kid again, like obsessed with tanks and like warfare and Warcraft. And like I follow these Twitter feeds where I'm like counting up all the different tanks and armored personnel carriers that have been blown up and captured and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just obsessed with the whole thing, from like the top level strategizing to the bottom level who's taken over which road and stuff. So it's just like, yeah. So apologies if I
see a bit distracted,
forget who Jesus is and stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm having the same problem. It's like, it's such a huge, massive situation. And all I can think of is, I hope this is what brings down Putin finally.
Well, it's just like, so, briefly, as we've got a few minutes, and I'm obsessed. Like, so he can't win. There's no way he can win because he's had to change his strategy. So the original thing was deposing Zelensky and putting in a pro-Russian government. But the problem is, I don't understand. So he told his troops they'll welcome you with open arms. And then they didn't so either they were lying to the troops or they genuinely thought that. And either way, that's poor strategy because they weren't going to welcome them with open arms, which means he either had the worst intelligence on earth, because even I could look at the news and go, Ukraine are not going to be happy about this. If I can have a more accurate understanding of the geopolitical landscape than Putin and his cabinet, he's got something wrong. So they had to change to an all-out invasion. But of course, they weren't prepared for an all-out invasion. And they rely very much on like trains for logistics. And when Ukraine blew up the train lines, then they're basically fucked. Yeah. And the northern mud scenario is very much like World War II all over again. And it's just like you're not prepared for an all-out invasion. So now you're in this, but to save face, there's got to be an off-ramp for you, but there is no off-ramp because all the Ukrainians now hate you.
Yes.
So the only way you can leave this sphere by winning in any way is utter destruction of Ukraine and flattening the cities like you did with Grozny. So it's like the only win is flattening Ukraine, and then it's no use to you. Right. So you can't. And they will be running an insurgency, a guerrilla insurgency forever. So you can't win.
In the meantime, you see Russians in the street saying "Death to Putin" signs in protest. It's like, that blows my mind.
So that's a really interesting scenario. There are more prisoners in Russian prisons now, political prisoners, than in the height of the Cold War. But the other thing that's worth understanding is there are more internal security members than army. So you've got this really weird situation where he's closed off because it's an information war. Putin's all about information.
Sure.
Just the whole information thing. So you've got some Russians who are just like, he's not gone to war. This is a special operation, just sinking everything that Putin's told them. And
Jono, hold that thought. Hold that thought, Jono. In the meantime, we've come back and we've started the show.
We started the show and we've had a little bit of a highlight of Russia from Jonathan. I want to thank him for that. I'm probably going to just keep that at the beginning just because it's awesome. I mean, guys, I want to say, can we pull it together to say, I know we're all a little skeptical about Jesus, aren't we? Between the three of us, right? But one thing that let's just use the word transcend here for some good old fun and measure here. But whether it's in Russia or North America or Ukraine, which by the way actually meant border. Did you know that Ukraine actually meant, it used to be the Ukraine?
Yeah,
the border,
right.
It was. So now it's, I mean, how would you like to be called a buffer state? That is your function. You're a pawn, by the way. You're a pawn. And by the way, we can't do anything for you because, if we do, the world's going to Armageddon. That's an interesting dilemma philosophically. But let me tie this all together and say, but there's one Jesus, no matter where you live, right? It's all about love. And there's the Russian Jesus, and there's the Ukrainian Jesus, and there's the North American Jesus. And, how do we unify all that? Isn't it all about universal history?
You'd think so. And yet I don't think there's ever been a time when there's ever actually been the one true Jesus, right from the get-go, even. Poor Jonathan. Those Russian hackers.
Do you know what? I think as soon as I have a go at Putin, like my internet's fine, but I think they're directly hacking into my
Clearly.
very existence.
We're all thinking the same thing. Yep. Well, if we can tortuously swing the conversation back to Jesus, as Daniel was heroically trying to do just now.
Yeah.
Daniel, give us another lead into that.
Another lead in. Okay. Well, I'll wind up. I'll throw the pitch, and you guys see if you can smack this one. Okay. I mean, I'm fine to talk about Putin. I really am. I mean, the thing is that when you're looking at this, when you look at the orthodoxy of Russia, okay, it's kind of like the Western tradition of the Greek Orthodox that I partially am really kind of romantic about in a way, right? I mean, you have a society that still very much values the Platonic ideals and the origin story of, where, this Greek origin came from.
Yeah.
By no means am I condoning anything, in terms of the violence and everything, but it is an anomaly from a Christian manifestation, from an orthodoxy. And the question I want to ask both David and Jonathan in turn here, we'll start with David and then we'll pass it to Jonathan. What flavor of Christianity does this produce?
There's a really interesting dichotomy about Putin. He's both this KGB communist and he's this Russian Orthodox. And for years, I've been talking about how, the old bugaboo used to be, atheists, they're all godless communists. And, there's more people killed in the name of atheism than Christianity, ridiculous ad hominems like that. But it's fascinating that communism and Stalinism, Marxism, whichever way you want to cut it, it acts like a political religion in so many ways. It's got dogma that can't be questioned. Doesn't treat humanism very kindly. It twists science to its own uses. There's all these different analogies where you can line up to a religious cult, a political religion, if you will. And nowadays, now we're in the post-Soviet era, Putin is kind of going back to his Orthodox roots, or at least, politically going back to his roots. Who knows what's going on in his head? But it's interesting and worrying to see how he ties this in to classical Russian Orthodoxy to get the support of the church for the things he's doing, which I find very troubling. Very troubling.
I see religion and church institutions as really, really useful tools for people to use to their advantage. I defend religion sometimes when I hear people say quite simplistically, religion causes all the wars in history. And I say, actually, no, it doesn't. Religion causes very few wars, but humans cause wars. And they will use religion as a really, really efficient and very close to hand tool in order to perpetuate the us and them narrative in order to achieve whatever goals they might want to achieve. And very often it looks very much like religion. But even take the Northern Ireland scenarios where you've got, Catholics against Protestant, it looks very much like a religious war. No, it's not. It's a colonial scenario where we've, the British Empire, if you like, or Britain, ferried in a bunch of Protestants broadly from Scotland, but it was kind of an us and them narrative that where you are identified by your religion, but it's not the religious content that's causing the war. It's not religion itself that's causing the war. It's humans of different tribes causing the war. And it's very easy to confuse. It's like almost like a correlation fallacy where these people are Protestants, these people are Catholics, therefore they're having a war that is a religious war. No, it's a war that is dressed up in religion, but that's not really what's driving it. And so my broad point is that religion is very easy to be used as a political tool. And Putin's done that superbly. He's got into bed with the Russian Orthodox Church to perpetuate culture wars narrative, very much like you see in American politics, where the church and religiosity is used to kind of, perpetuate the culture wars narrative in America, where it's like the war on Christmas, or it's abortion, or it's this and that, and it's a battle that's fought, with these religious overtures, but I don't know if it's actually religion that's responsible for these wars.
Right, we're mistaking the identity marker for the cause of it.
Exactly. And you could maybe do a little bit of investigation in terms of like abortion. Where's a causality that goes on in trying to attack Roe v. Wade? Is there a religious component that is driving the pro-life? Or is it? And I think that's an interesting debate as to really what's going on there.
What's something interesting about that is I've noticed when you were talking about Northern Ireland, there was a polarity between the IRA British debacle and the way they would identify with the Israeli Palestinian. The IRA definitely identified with the PLO. The English definitely identified with Israel. And now in this situation, we've got Putin. And just by virtue of things like his stance on gays, there's American evangelicals who love Putin. And we're still getting Putin apologists even now, which for somebody who grew up during the Cold War in America, where the Republicans were almost staunchly anti-communist, to see them flip now and embrace Putin just blows my mind.
That's fascinating. And you get these people at Trump rallies that are wearing, I'd rather be a Ruskin than vote Democrat. And
absolutely.
So you've got these, sometimes I think American politics is fascinating because you get these identity markers where it's like in for a penny, in for a pound. So it's like, right, okay, these guys represent me because I am Second Amendment. I'm all about guns, right? And so therefore, if these guys do what I want in terms of guns, I don't care about anything else.
Right.
So they can increase my taxes, or they can lower my taxes, or they can do this about that, or they can do that about that. So I'm like a single issue voter. But what then goes on is you get this single issue is then like this party will say, right, guns, but it's abortion, but it's this and that. And all these individual single issues that actually people are like really keyed into this particular issue, but they then get the whole package along with them. So they end up being all of these key issues. But quite often when it comes to actual economic politics and stuff like that, they're voting for things, they're biting off their nose to spite their face, because it's like they may be like white working class, people struggling to get by. So they vote for this party on like Second Amendment, abortion, religion, and all this stuff.
When in truth, that party doesn't care anything about any of those wedge issues. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And they're the party that is actually the worst for them, economically speaking and welfare state speaking. But so it's just really, it's fascinating.
Yeah. And horrifying. Yes.
Yeah. And so, but I suppose long has that been the case where, you might go back to Constantine to like draw this back to maybe where you guys might want to take it. But was Constantine as the emperor, Roman emperor, who took on Christianity as a state religion, was that a political decision, or was that a genuine decision of religiosity and being evangelically Christian?
Well, for me, I mean, that's a subject near and dear to my heart because I've written a lot about it. And the closest I can get to any genuine feelings of warmth that Constantine had might have come from the fact that his mother was a Christian. That's the one and only thing that I can see where he seemed to have some legitimate warmth for it. Everything else just seems coldly calculated, realpolitik, economic driven, and just and at the same time he was the first Christian emperor, he was also a pagan emperor in every sense of the word. And that transition from being a pagan emperor to a Christian emperor, though he never gave up, turned his back on either side through his whole life.
So I don't know enough about the details. Maybe you could enlighten me. But in what ways was Christianity useful for him in delivering, his empire-wide goals?
Right. Well, for one thing, it was this block where they were completely devoted to what their bishop told them to do. They were united behind him. All the Christian propaganda at that time, or the Christian apologetics at the time, extorts their flocks to, you should be attuned to your bishop as harps to strings to a harp. He liked that. That was something really useful for him. Taking privilege, imperial privilege from the pagan temples and gradually drifting it to the Christian temples was a financial windfall for the emperor, because, we're going to close down this temple over here since it's not really usable. So we're going to take all this gold, all this jewels, and that'll just go into the imperial treasury. And it also helped that his predecessors had persecutions against the Christians. So by turning on that, he could become this rescuer and be considered savior of the empire. And again, I want to make it clear, at the same time he did all these things, he was still doing all the requisite things that a pagan emperor had to do to get the approval of the pagan gods. And a lot of the things we think of as being strictly Christian under Constantine were actually split between appealing to pagans and appealing to Christians. And I'll give you an example of that. His most famous incident probably is the viewing the cross at the vision of the cross that converted him to Christianity. That story never appears during his life. It only appears after his death. And it wasn't actually a vision of the cross. It was a vision of the Chi-Rho, the monogram for Christ, which also coincidentally also happened to be a pagan symbol. And we see him do this kind of thing throughout his career, where he does these things that appeal to both Christians and pagans at the same time. And as future went on, they just sort of forgot about all those things he was doing, like going to groves of Apollo and the Arc de Triomphe that shows all the Greek gods, and Roman gods shining on him, that kind of thing. And he just became the first Christian emperor, even though it's really his successors who actually became the first Christian emperor. Yeah. So
they ran with it. Yeah. And his mother was pretty important, as you say, when you were talking about the discovery of Jesus' birthplace and the church, right, the Holy Sepulchre, and it was her really that found it, and et cetera, et cetera.
And not only that, but that's what started the pilgrimage and the tourism, the religious tourism industry. There was nothing going on like that for the first 3 or 4 centuries of Christianity, but that was the impetus for that.
Because one of the arguments I used in my Resurrection, a critical examination book, although it's one of these sort of later arguments which isn't like hugely powerful, and I'll explain why it's not hugely powerful, but it's something I think is definitely worth considering, which is, why was the tomb not venerated? So we know that Jewish so the idea is that the tomb wasn't venerated until Constantine's mother supposedly found no, this is a birthplace, sorry, but
actually the same factors stand because it was the same exact phenomenon going on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So why was the birthplace not venerated in the same way that why was the tomb not venerated? So this is an argument to say that it's because they were later inventions. They weren't venerated. So if you're talking about the time from when Jesus supposedly died to the time that the Gospels were written, why is there no veneration or no evidence that Jesus' death place and resurrection place? I mean, after all, this was the place where Jesus supposedly, as a human God, a God man, resurrected into life again, or not again, but came back to life. So why was this not venerated? This is surely evidence towards the fact that the empty tomb was just a later invention, and that's why there was no veneration.
And it seems worth mentioning at that point that we never actually agreed on which is the one true tomb of Christ. I think there's 3 that are in operation right now, at least 2.
Wait a minute, guys! Before we go into the tomb, I want to expand a little bit on this distinction between the pagan and Christianity, just for a minute.
Yeah.
Let me sketch this here for you in terms of virtue, which effectively makes it a philosophy anchored in ethics. And so, from a pagan standpoint, which is interesting, it almost sounds like a little bit of the barbarism turning back on itself. Because what does it sound like to the? I don't know what it sounds like to you guys, but a pagan god to me sounds like a little primordial or something. And I'm educated around it, right? I understand the Greek origins of it, but it's almost like a dismissal or a slur. Well, he was pagan. Well, what does this mean that we're pagan? I mean, we're Greek in a sense. So there's 4 virtues, as you guys probably already know from a Greek standpoint, one of which is courage or fortitude. Okay, justice. Okay, and there's all of those conversations in the Republic about what's just and not just and these types of things. Temperance and prudence. And prudence, it really just is wisdom. Okay, so all of a sudden you move this into Christianity and you get the 3 additional: faith, hope, and charity. And so when you bring up somebody like Constantine's mother, I want to just pause and think, when life is in its end, or you're realizing what really is important to you, an embodiment of love, I think is very appealing. Like, I think there's some deep-seated, how do you get underneath that? How do you get underneath this idea of love with the comparison to a pagan reality, which really tries to elevate the intellectual hero, the philosopher, that is really the replacement for that Homeric warrior type. And so you see this progression of warrior to Socrates to, hey, wait a minute, everybody's sitting there saying, I don't know what God you want me to believe in, but to me, the universal is love. And right. So then if I pause and I think about faith, hope, and charity, I'm thinking, well, faith is an interesting thing. If you really kind of think about it, it's like, I really don't have all the answers. I really can't show up in a discussion like we're having here and really hold my own. Right. I don't know really how to intellectually stand on my own 2 feet. But what I do know is that I have love, and I can feel that just as strongly as you can. So like, I don't need my language. I don't need my rationality. I can live it through the embodiment and the example of Jesus Christ. And that is the only universal history that I need. Right.
Gotcha.
How am I scaffolding this correctly? Like, I mean, I might be trying to psychologize this a little bit, but
no, I think you are. And I think one point I do want to make is when I say pagan, I'm using that as a catch-all term for a whole panoply of different philosophies and different approaches to life that just happen to not be Christian. But I don't want to imply that it was all one amorphous monolithic blob at all.
And I think just to sorry to interrupt, but I think pagan's a really problematic term. I think it's hugely Christocentric, and it's like you get all these, anything else is pagan. It's like, well, what about, is now Judaism pagan? Is Islam pagan? Why is Islam not pagan? Just a different timescale. So I have a real problem with paganism because I think it's kind of really ill-defined.
And I totally take your point, John. Maybe we could say Greco-Roman Hellenic culture. And I think that's more to the mark. But even that encompasses a wide range of things. Yeah. And part of what made the Hellenistic period so interesting is it was this cosmopolitan, universal belief that was bringing in all these new ideas and joining them together. I have been doing a talk this last year on the evolution of religion, and that point, it's not a simple case of like animism becomes polytheism becomes monotheism, because monotheism and polytheism go back and forth in that spectrum. But the universalism of these religions, where you go from tribal religions to a shaman, to a chieftain, to a city state, to an empire, the more you go up and the more different facets, more people that you can feel like you can do business with. It's like when you don't feel like you have anything in common, you can't work together with this other people, all the scriptures are, our God is bigger than yours and will smite you. But when the reality hits and you have all these other gods and these, sometimes you get smitten. Sometimes you join up with this other group. Sometimes now you're in a cluster of different city states, and all the different gods are on the same team now. You see that drive towards universalism, whether it's through polytheism or monolatry or flat out monotheism.
I think that's. I'm so glad. I was going to answer Daniel's point in terms of the evolution of God. Funnily enough, so perfectly agree with everything you say, and I think it's a really interesting point to note that the bigger your world becomes, the bigger your God needs to get, which is kind of exactly what you were saying, which is, if you're talking about, say, Yahweh as being the God of the Hebrews or whatever, the Canaanites or whatever.
A hill god that can't take out those pesky chariots on the hills because they're made of iron.
Exactly. Who has, as Francesca Stavropoulou, said that wrong, no doubt, says, had an anatomy, had body parts, and was very, very human in form. As your society gets bigger and bigger, your God gets bigger and bigger in terms of having to be more universal and more abstract. And so what happens is you have this, it's just part of that movement, is the evolution of both God and morality that's happened. So when you talk about
Jonathan, let me ask you then. So can we reduce this to a playground conversation where my dad can beat up your dad?
Yeah. So this is, I don't know if I said this in our last chat, which is, my God's bigger than your God. Well, my God's, your God times 10 times infinity plus 1 times infinity to the power of infinity. And then eventually God is abstracted out to being like this single entity that is all of the power that you were just talking about. Is the infinite power that exists kind of now outside the universe that causes the entire universe. It's not that my God causes thunder, and that God causes this, and that God is responsible for that. Is this God is responsible for everything? Is universal, and that
good and bad.
Yeah, and that needs to be the case, because as we are being interconnected with the whole world, that we understand that actually I don't just exist as this tribe in this particular area. We exist as humans in the entire world. And actually the world is now part of the universe, and we understand the universe. So therefore the God reflects that increasing size of and scope of humanity and existence to now, be out there.
And as it does that, ironically enough, all these paradoxes start showing up. Like, as the God gets more omni this and omni that, well, it's like, well, if that's the case, then how come we have that? Paradoxes that you don't see, ironically enough, in early religions. Yeah, there we go.
You've just made me spam you. This is what my latest book has just done. Yeah.
At the tribal level and at, very primitive level, their gods make perfect sense because they don't expect their gods to be perfect. They, and so it's funny how they're more consistent in a way, even though they're very capricious and they're not always arbiters of morality at all. There's no moral aspect to them often.
And you might get, let's say, a trickster god that's doing, X, Y, and Z, and doesn't need, is not required. So the thing about like abstracting your God into this abstraction of perfection is what is perfection? But okay, let's constrain it to omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, and having divine foreknowledge, and then suddenly God is actually constrained to being not very human, but being almost like some kind of automaton outside of the universe. God can do nothing but be all loving. So there are no God doesn't deliberate over choices. God is just some kind of algorithm that is making like decisions based, but that are entirely constrained by his own nature. He can do nothing but that which is the most loving. He can do nothing other than what he's already predicted he will do. So God cannot change. God, it has to be immutable because God has divine, perfect, infallible foreknowledge of his own future. So even God can't change what God is going to do.
And yet, when we look around the world around us, it doesn't seem to have been invented by somebody who is that omni-everything. There seems to be quite a
plate tectonics causing 240,000 people to die in a tsunami. But then if you're the theist who's developed this abstract idea of God, then you have to explain that in terms of that God. So everything, whether it be you stubbing your toe in the morning or 240,000 people dying in a tsunami, that cannot be gratuitous, and it all has to be explained. And everything that you see, whether it's like, why did that tree evolve like that? Or why is it like that? Well, God is ultimately responsible for everything. So the explanation is in God, and it all becomes.
Okay, well, we're gonna get David to explain a little bit more on that, and just as a fun impromptu exercise on your book that you just showed there, Jonathan, I'm gonna get you to turn to page 32, and I'm gonna get you to pull out something that jumps to you, that speaks to you, and maybe that's God, or maybe that's just your own internal voice. So David, what are you working on writing-wise? To give Jonathan just a little bit of seconds to compose his thoughts around page 32.
Brilliant. Yeah, I know already.
And he's set. You know what? We'll catch up to that after he's done his bit.
Oh no, I don't want to.
So he's so quick on his feet. He's so quick on his feet.
Well, I was
going to say,
funny enough, is exactly what we were just talking about. So, so this is about so the book is 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design. And page 32, I talk about disteleological arguments. So a teleological argument is a design argument, basically, where you got purpose and meaning sort of involved in design. So, and disteleological arguments look at God, arguments that are looking at design like plate tectonics, saying, hang on, this doesn't look, or the fact that you get appendicitis or things like this, that looks like really poor design. So what's going on there? And actually, when we look at the design, so-called design features of the universe, whether in organisms or plate tectonics or whatever, you can argue that this is argument against God existing because the design looks so poor. Anyway, sorry, that over to you, David.
I know. Well, just in a nutshell, what I'm working on right now is sort of a two-part book talking about the evolution of religion and talking about, as we all know, this whole show is founded on the myth of Jesus, the idea that Jesus is just a myth, for better or worse. When I was doing a talk on the evolution of religion, and stop me if I've brought this up on the show before, but one of the things that always struck me as odd, just as a side effect of studying Jesus's historicity question, was how many Buddhists would come up to me and say, yeah, we're having the same discussions in our circles about the Buddha. And how many ex-Muslims would say, yeah, we're having the same discussions about our circles about Muhammad. And Buddha I could see, but Muhammad, the fact that somebody was questioning Muhammad, somebody lived in the 6th, 7th century, we've had family trees of them. We have contemporary accounts, all these things, until they started saying, well, yeah, those aren't really contemporary. Yeah, those aren't really family trees. Yeah, this seems to have come 100 years before Muhammad. His biographical information doesn't seem to crystallize until 60 or 70 years after Muhammad. And there's all these other Arabic prophets coming out of those Arabic conquests, to the extent that now I'm thinking, and I'm not the first to think this, that the Quran and Islam are not the cause of the Arabic conquest, but the result of the Arabic conquests. And looking into the top 10 religions of the world today, and even older ones like Zoroastrianism, it seems like all of them across the board have the same dodgy backstory. And now, to be atheists, none of them have to be mythological, but it would be perfectly fine if the founder of Sikhism, Guru Nanak, was a real person. But when you look at the history, it's like it seems the religions start halfway through their official history, if that makes sense. So like there's 10 gurus in Sikhism, which is barely even 500 years old. And yet all the evidence we have for Sikhism seems to start with like number 5 in that lineup. And this is true across the board. The only two that don't really have that going is Shintoism and Hinduism, which seem to be so old that there is no real, they don't even claim to have a founder figure. And they're just these consolidations of different local tribal clan religions. So yeah, it's that I find it's one of those things that I thought at one point it seems super obvious in hindsight, and yet it's mind blowing to me at the same time. It seems weirdly churlish that it's the 21st century and we're still talking about all the ways that religion is not true. And yet,
but yet there's something quite obvious that we know that it's not true. I mean, I like the evasion that happens when we take somebody like a Jordan Peterson, and he's somewhat changed his tune now, but it's like, are you religious? Well, it depends what you mean by religious. You believe in God. Well, it depends what you mean by God. And I think there's a point where you have to say, wait a minute, what if you want to talk about the truth in the wisdom of the stories? We're all game to that,
right?
You know what I mean? Like wisdom is wisdom. This is
it's when we have that temptation to say this is truth and this is true because these things really happen, not because of the wisdom these stories contain, but because we have to believe that these stories actually really happened, and if we don't, bad things happen to us in the
I think it's interesting with some of these figures, and I would pull William Lane Craig into this very clearly, which is the political and economic ramifications to what they declare. So someone like Jordan Peterson, when he's asked, is he religious, he has to obfuscate and go all around,
be all things to all people.
Exactly, because so many of his core base will expect him to be religious, and if he's not, then they won't buy his books. William Lane Craig, famously in debates, when he was often challenged on the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament inaccuracies and moral problems, he would just hold up Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster, and say, go and read that, and wouldn't really answer the questions because he wouldn't be tied to whether the Old Testament was infallible. Now, he's a bit older now and everything's done and dusted as far as most of his debates have been and happened. And he's now saying some things a little bit controversial that he's getting into a lot of trouble for. But if he had said that early doors, he wouldn't have the financial enterprise and all of these different organizations that he would be making a lot of money from. So it's interesting when you ask certain people, what they believe, and they're very kind of like...
Yeah. And I wonder how self-aware somebody like William Lane Craig is. It's like, when I look at something like the Mormon Church, for example, there is no way on earth that the upper tier of that don't know that it's all a wild, unflinching bullshit. Just from the get-go. There's just no way they can't know that.
I just went to see the Book of Mormon this week in the theater this week. Loved it. But yeah, carry on.
See the Netflix show Murder Amongst the Mormons, which they did a really good job of portraying that. I knew the whole story front and back, and I was still on the edge of my seat. And yet, as much as I loved it, they didn't bring up the most important part for me, was that the leadership of the church, who were being played by, played for suckers and spending money hand over fist to take these things that they thought were legitimate artifacts that show Mormonism is false, so that they could hide it away in their artifacts, their archives. The fact that they did that knowingly, it's super hard for me to accept. How could they have such cognitive dissonance that they don't know? What
if as a church father, okay, because I'm not trying to make excuses for this at all, but
sure,
you know what I mean? You're trying to provide leadership, and it's
right.
like, I look at cohesion in an organization as a owner of a business. Okay.
Yeah.
Frame it that way.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, there's all this information out in the peripheral, right? That's going to cause nothing but not allow people to do what they're supposed to do, their jobs or whatever. It's just going to cause friction. Let's take it away, because there's no point having it out there. It causes nothing but heartache and strife and controversy, and we don't need it. Just take it away, right? So when people ask about it, say, we're not going to talk about that. Stop thinking about that. Leave that alone. So it's about putting the guardrails up, putting social cohesion in place, and allowing that to happen. But the issue is you can't, when it comes to faith, you can't be forthright with that, which actually, to me, if I'm a God-believing, now this is here, I'm walking in very, very weird waters here, right? But I can take the idea of God and the idea of pureness and the idea that should be universal, and I can say, if I want to believe in something that represents that, then transparency and complete understanding and omnipotence, that's what it means.
Yeah.
Right. So, there should be nothing to hide by revealing the truth. We should have the ability to do that.
That is the thing. There should be nothing to hide. There's no reason to lie about being good when there's good reasons to be good.
Because there's good in itself, right? So the good in itself reveals, and God's will, blah, 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 right? That type of thing.
All these things.
I can play the Disney story out in my child mind, and then I can understand the reason why. But what's happened is the C-suite, the CEOs in charge, are going, that's not a good strategy here.
Well, you know what? I think, just to jump in real fast, I think that split level effect was going on even before the church became profitable. I think that went back to the Hellenistic mystery faiths, where you'd have these myths and they're encoding life lessons, or they're encoding astronomical data. And this seemed very important to the people then, but for the people who didn't understand what these myths were allegories for, it was just a story they could hang their hat on. I think that's where our Gospels come right out of that tradition.
I think there's a really interesting thing to note about Mormonism and about literally the Book of Mormon, in what both of you were saying, and in talking about effectively lying for Jesus, or lying for,
fill in the blank.
Why should you? Why should you have to lie if this is the truth, and blah blah blah, etc. etc. So, and this is something I bring up because there's such good parallels with Mormonism in my resurrection book, with the idea of could the gospel writers and could Paul have just been telling untruths when they were saying they were having these experiences of Jesus? What's the chance of some of these just not being true appearances or not being true experiences, especially given the usefulness for claims to authority that appearances might have, or appearance stories might have had?
And you can see that Paul, he's definitely wants to constantly reassure his readers that he's not lying, that this is coming to him straight through the divine headset, through God. And yet he never tells us anything remotely like the story of the road to Damascus. Luke gives us different incompatible versions of it. He never says anything remotely like that. When he talks about where his authority comes from, and apostles like him, they're people who read the Jewish scriptures and heard the voice of God's Son, the Spirit of God's Son speaking to them. And when he talks about how we know that Christ died for our sins, according to the scripture, and that he was buried and rose on the third day, according to the scripture, everything he gets, he repeatedly tells us that's where he's getting it from. divine revelations and scriptural study.
Yeah.
Let me clarify something here about Paul. Sorry, Jonathan. It's a hang up that you guys both know more than I do on this. So with Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, he's the self-proclaimed apostle. He's that 13th apostle that kind of comes in and says, I'm an apostle too.
Well, here's the thing. He never says, I'm an apostle too, because he doesn't recognize that the leaders of the Jerusalem church are apostle. He doesn't even think they're real Christians, which blows my mind. The guys we think of as Jesus' friends and family, he's on the outs with, basically through his whole career.
Because there are political or, in some sense, theological wranglings going on in terms of authority and who has the authority in the early church.
Right.
And just to what you were saying, like Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? So he is using his appearance experience as a way to say, am I not super important here? Am I, he is stamping his authority by saying, look, I've had an appearance.
Yeah.
Experience.
And when Christians of his generation are talking about the hierarchy of the church, you've got the apostles, and apostles are guys who the Lord has spoken to. And all these things from faith healers to deacons to, all the way down the line. But Jesus's disciples, that doesn't exist in the rest of the New Testament. Jesus' family, those categories don't exist for Paul and Christians of his generation, like the book of Hebrews, for instance.
So what I was going to say about the Book of Mormon, and so could it be that Paul was lying about his experience? Could it be that the gospel writers were lying about his experience? So when we look back to the Book of Mormon, you've done lots of work on Mormonism, haven't you, David? So you'll know a lot more than me. But there were three witnesses: Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer. Who and this is how David Whitmer writes with regard to having this experience, this appearance experience. So he says, it was in the latter part of June 1829. Joseph, Oliver Cowdery, and myself were together, and the angel showed them the plates to us. We were sitting on a log when we were overshadowed by light more glorious than that of the sun. In the midst of this light, but a few feet from us, appeared a table upon which were mighty golden plates. Also the sword of Laban and the directors. I saw them as plain as I see you now, and distinctly heard the voice of the Lord declaring that the records of the plates of the Book of Mormon were translated by the gift and power of God. So these experiences...
I want to stop you there. I just want to stop you there because later there's 8 more witnesses brought on board to consolidate that. And yet every single one of them at some point recanted those.
This is what it's coming on to. Yeah.
Like Martin Harris said, for instance, I didn't see it with my physical eyes the way I see that pencil case over there. I see it through the eyes of faith, as if, a city through a mountain or something like that.
So as I go on to say is that, and this gets written into the beginning of the Book of Mormon. So this experience that they have is then written in the book of every Book of Mormon. But then the problem is, as I write, is that Harris in 1838 recanted the experience, claiming that it was only a mental vision, and this reality was the same for the signatories. The 3 witnesses had never seen or handled the golden plates, and this in turn caused 5 very influential members, of which the 3 were apostles, to leave the church, so on and so forth. So sometimes you hear the term liars for Jesus. Well, here we have a case of lying for Smith and the Mormon church. So the point is, that do we have the point of writing that is just a fantastic parallel. Do we have a good example of people claiming to have experiences for political gain, for influential gain, and then us knowing that these were not veridical experiences? Well, yes, here's a case where they're recounted, and then this pissed off a load of people. They left the church. Okay, so this could have happened with Christianity, but they didn't recant because they had no need to.
Right, and it's so beautiful you're bringing this up, because the thing I love about Mormonism is we're seeing it all in real time. We have photographs, we have the writings, we have the actual thing, so you can see him creating this story, making changes to it, going on with it, and the story evolving. Even that story we just heard about the plates and everything, most early Mormons didn't hear that story until decades into the church's history, which blows my mind. It's like, what was the attraction for this religion? Yeah.
And I was seeing the Trey Parker and Matt Stone, Book of Mormon comedy thing as I did this week. It was so beautiful. There were so many meta things that I took out of that, which was this is obviously ridiculous, but the main guy hadn't read it, and so he was just making up. Have you seen the Book of Mormon?
I have, and, and more importantly, I've seen the South Park episode on Mormonism.
Oh, right, which I don't think I've seen. But
you have to. It's brilliant.
So he ends up making up this stuff, and then they believe it, and then they find out that's a load of rubbish, and they say, "Well, we might as well believe the same type thing." And there's all these meta narratives going on, which is like, well, this is a ridiculous. Obviously ridiculous story about Joseph Smith and the Angel Moroni and all that kind of stuff. And then we've obviously made up this ridiculous stuff and people are believing it. And so therefore there's that parallel. But then it's kind of like, well, can't we just take the good stuff out of these different like beliefs and anyway, and just believe nice stuff even if we don't believe in God? And so there's all these interesting, like nice sort of meta observations that came out of that, which I think are applicable to all the religions of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to that Simpsons episode, since we're on this cartoon binge for right now, where the Jedediah Springfield, the founder of their town, it turns out he's a horrible pirate and it's an awful, awful human being. And yet at the end, Lisa doesn't do an expose on it because the myth of Jedediah Springfield gives so much, benefits and joy. And
it's like the ghost. It's like the ghost of Kiev, like this Ukrainian fighter pilot that supposedly shot down all these like Russian bombers or Russian planes, and now everyone's like, actually, this doesn't exist.
Isn't it wild? All these Christians say, "Oh no, Christianity, it was way too early to start myths happening." It's like we're not even 10 days into the Ukrainian war, and we're getting myths coming out.
That's a really good point, because my 15-year-old son brought that up about the fighter pilot, and think about what feels better. Okay.
Yeah.
That story about that fighter pilot, right, means that my 15-year-old son can go, yeah, that's amazing. Right. Or we can do an expose on it. We can, bring Dateline NBC in and, expose it for the bunk that it is. And then what's left? It's a nullity. It's gone. Now there's nothing cohesive in terms of that story of hero. Followed by worship, right? I mean, the seedling for that is now gone.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
The question would be for you, I suppose, David and Daniel, is it whether there was ever a nugget of truth there, right? Whether there was a pilot that maybe shot down 2 planes, and it was like, and then it sort of generated, and then blah blah blah, or whether this was just mythological from the beginning,
right?
Discuss.
Knowing what I know now, it's like the possibility that somebody just made up the story because it made them feel good seems to be behind much of human history and religion. Not just religion either, but QAnon is just as imaginary and mythological as anything L. Ron Hubbard dreamed up or the Angel Moroni. I'm going
to get your guys' your perspective on an evolutionary component to religiosity. Okay, so the reason why I want to bring this up, and I'll frame it like this: what this is, let's go back to our comments and thinking about Mormonism. Okay, so you have apparent contradictions, a breakdown between founding members, but what sticks and what resonates? Could I be so bold to say that there's and I'm going to add the word like a socially selective pressure here that says we remember the story, the fantastic and mythological story, but we over time we're going to forget the people, the dissenters. We're going to, and yet at the beginning of that you had people with well-formed intentions to say, you know what, I believe in something metaphysical. I believe in the truth. I believe in what we're doing here as a group. But what I don't believe is in that, because I know that's not true. So I can't now put my name behind it. So I'm out of here. But what remains?
If I may jump in. And this is that tightrope we walk when it's like, oh, should we tear down religion or should we encourage the good parts of religion? let me think about this before we go in, because I had it and I lost it. The problem with giving religion a free pass, as I see it, in order to preserve those nuggets of truth that are encoded in this mythology or whatever else you want to call it, is that, evolutionary speaking, religion has a way of making that not work out. And our perfect example right now is how many people have died of COVID through no other good reason except that they think God wants them to not get a vaccine. The further whatever worldview you embrace, the further it's removed from reality for whatever reason, out of good motives or bad, the more dangerous it is in the long run. Good. And I used to see movies like Idiocracy and mourn for humanity, but COVID is playing out that the opposite is also true. There's a reason why it's important to embrace reality, warts and all.
Good answer. And I'm going to say it's not the warts. I say good with a capital G, not just because it's at the beginning of the sentence. I mean, honestly, you think there's a truth to revealing the evolutionary story that is a goodness in itself, because it's absolutely true.
And it's fascinating.
And it's fascinating. So I know Jonathan's just chomping at the bit here, but I want to throw another thing into the mix. And I want to say, what do you guys think about the new atheist movement being accused of being almost like a religion in itself? And so, Jonathan, go.
Well, I don't know that because my brain's not very good at holding on to things these days. I just want to comment on what you were just talking about, which is intrinsic values to things like truth and knowledge. And so it depends how you do your moral philosophy, but there are pluralistic moral value framework. So normally in something like consequentialism, utilitarianism, you're talking about the well-being or like pleasure and pain or lack of harm, right? So that's kind of like your non-derivative currency to a moral value system. What I mean by that is, like, say, happiness. You can't derive it further. Why did you do that? Because of this. But why do you do that? Because of this. Or why is that good? Because of this. And it usually gets down to something like happiness. And you say, well, why do you want to be happy? Well, it's self-evidently good.
It's just really a brute fact. Yeah.
So it's a good axiom. So it's non-derivative. So, but are there other things that are non-derivative? So is knowledge good intrinsically, or is knowledge good because eventually it will lead you to happiness? Do you know what I mean? So when you're saying, so the question, sorry, I'm going to spam you again. I wrote another book recently, why I'm atheist and not a theist.
Can we go to page 32 after you're done on that?
How to do knowledge, meaning, and morality in a godless world. And this is what is perfect to what you were just saying, because I wrote a chapter in that called, Do We Have a Good Reason to Believe Something Even If It Is False, right? Or something like that. So this idea that is exactly what you're just talking about is could there be elements of religion that are so beneficial that it's good to believe it, even though the overarching idea of that religion is false? Or is it always good to err on the side of truth and accurate knowledge? And there's an interesting debate you can have there, and it depends on how long it might be that it's beneficial to believe something that's false over a 1 year basis, but actually when you're measuring it across humanity over time, it's not beneficial. So it depends how you work these things out. But there's lots of interesting debate to have over whether there's other things other than happiness, whether knowledge has intrinsic value in and of itself. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think in my personal life, there's lots of times where I feel like I would never embrace something deliberately false. But as far as calling somebody else out on their false beliefs, sometimes I don't do that, and not out of any fear particularly, but I've grown accustomed to knowing when a person is open to hearing something and when they're not, and trying to facilitate that process.
I love it. You're giving birth. No, but I mean that in a midwifery of sorts, right? I mean, this is a very platonic, process, right? And Plato's very humble, or the Socrates of Plato. Very humble, and it's you would think there's times where it seems like he's kind of showboating, but it's trying to reveal through that discussion. I say, I one of my go-tos is as a young guy, I'd say, I mean, this is just ridiculous. How could anybody believe in this? And this kind of stuff, right? And one time my grandmother caught me flat-footed. She says, when I die, I just I know I'm going to see you again. And how do I argue that? I mean, I know how to intellectually argue it, but
no, you're not. You're going to be worm food.
How do you say that to grandma?
Yeah.
No, I just don't want to say it to grandma.
Yeah. Exactly. Me too. And literally true in my grandma's case. I literally did not want to have that discussion with her. And yet it's just one of those fun little dichotomies of life that we're on the balance beam. That on the internet, I'm got a megaphone shouting it at every point.
But I think that's where you're maybe so disabusing an individual person of a myth that's actually going to give them joy in some small aspect of their life is kind of different from like, what if everyone believed this all the time? What does society is harmed? So there can be a good for you individually in this short term idea before your eventual death, but actually, if all society believed in heaven and hell, what does this? How does this work with how a society operates? And are they actually net negatives?
And I think Socrates has a lot to tell us about how to go about that. I think the Socratic method of drawing people up through questions, laying the groundwork to how do we know this is true? That's an interesting thing. Where did you learn that? And I find that's a lot more.
The thing I've been experiencing with I'm a Platonist philosopher, through and through. I think I can't help myself. I've been going back again and reading again. And I think the thing that a couple points of criticism for any listeners, that I guess it's helping me in my continual journey to rediscover Platonism. Is I noticed that in various translations, you actually have they're like essays or like prefaces to an upcoming dialogue, right? And there is, I think we have a focus on authenticity, right? Like there's always an underlining, was this what Plato said? Was this correct? Was this real? And there's part of me that thinks, who
cares?
Does it matter?
Why does it matter, really?
Yeah.
What's the theme and the wisdom behind this? I mean, think of it. It's an easy thing. Philosophy is wisdom. It is about a revealing of the wisdom here. And so when the people that resonate the most with me are the people that can, go to that direct source of wisdom and try and understand so that it can start to reveal what the actual, not just so much the arguments, and I think the reason why I'm a Platonist is because I've even seen that how it subsequently started to unfold with the Neoplatonists and then move into an ideological consequence, I guess, is that it's how it was interpreted. And, and then I find myself defending something almost in a similar vein to a contemporary Marxist might defend it and say, well, you can't blame Marxism because, we've killed millions of people. It's just, why don't we try it again? Why don't we try it again? So I realize that that's intellectually, kind of my go-to as a philosopher. I keep going back to Plato because and I think, Jonathan, you'd mentioned that I think you're not a Platonist, or you don't.
I was so in terms of ontological realism, so abstract ideas, concepts, do they exist objectively outside of the conceiver's mind? I'm definitely not a Platonist, so I would say that concepts are I'm what's called a conceptual nominalist. So I'd say that the idea of redness or love or courage or mathematics will die with the death of all sentient life. So if all the books that David, you and I have written, when all sentient life in the universe dies in the heat death of the universe or whatever, all those ideas will cease to exist.
It's only got a good 3 trillion years, and that's very.
But the thing is, Jonathan, is I 100% agree with you. And so then that makes me not a Platonist, because there's not this realm of of something
perfect forms and this and that.
Exactly. But what I think Plato's doing is he's describing our ability to abstract in terms that make sense to a Hellenic perfectionist, basically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would need to go and do some serious reading of Plato to see exactly, but it depends how you define.
I want to just say, I get to the same place you do. It's just that I'm a connoisseur of it, because it's like fine wine and fine art. It's such a beautiful description of our abstract capability and the birth of through that Hellenic tradition of our Western culture. That's it. That's all I use it for.
Let me jump in super fast, just so I don't forget. At some point, Daniel, you and I have to have a talk about Platonism and early Judaism, because there's been some really interesting discoveries about that. But that's just.
But I think you were talking earlier on about the evolution of God, and I talked about that as well. And I said I want to talk about the evolution of morality, but because I think you're talking about where does it all fit in with Greek influence and Constantine and so on and so forth. I see something like, take the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and you have the covenant code, Deuteronomic laws, the Decalogue, which is the 10 Commandments. You've got all these moral laws, which are basically the central part of the Bible. A lot of scholars that say the whole point of Genesis and Exodus is to move towards the moral laws. They're all kind of like their preamble. People nowadays think they're so important, Genesis and actually it's just your vehicle to get to the moral laws. So, but the moral laws are themselves fit into the context. If you're a secular historian, if you're not like in bed with the Bible, then you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, you look at the Code of Hammurabi, you look at the Hittite laws, you look at the Numi laws, and all these other Ishtar or what
sure.
But you've got all these other legal codes that they are that the covenant code, for example, is directly drawing on verbatim in certain parts. And but what Christians and Orthodox Jews will do is they'll take the Bible and they will make it an exceptional document. There is a biblical exceptionalism where I take it out of context and you say it is not. There's no intertextuality here. It is not derived from all these other sources. It is in and of itself this perfect sort of document. And it's like, no, it's obviously not. And you know what? It doesn't stop at the Bible. So you get all these legal codes and stories and myths, and then you get the Bible, and then you get the New Testament. So you get the Hebrew Bible, then you get the New Testament, which is adding on to that, is built on those foundations, and then blah 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 blah. You get all the theology that happens there, and you get Aquinas, and then you get the UN Charter of Human Rights, and then you get, so it's like, and what's better? Because I can tell you, as a moral code, the UN Charter of Human Rights is a damn sight better than the Hebrew Bible. Like,
sure.
It's uncontested.
I was hoping you were saying that. I was hoping, because I was like, uh-oh. Right?
It's just degrading the true word of.
But there's nothing about blasphemy. That's a big problem.
But the issue is that we're already creating. So let's talk about the UN. The UN Charter. See, this is the thing and I think that's where you have, bringing it all back to Putin, is that you have worldviews that are now saying, well, wait a minute. That's part of the NWO, which is the New World Order, which is not what Putin's envisioning, right? In terms of the fatherland, and it just there's a buffer state. We had a balance of power, and we can see that the UN is growing. It's got this force that's kind of moving, and not a real force, but it's actually growing. The ideology, the dogma, and the values are moving across our civilization. And there's people that are saying, "That's it. That's enough. I'm not bowing down to that." And now we have this.
But the possibly blips. So Steven Pinker, in his books, the Better Angels of Our Nature, I think I often get that title wrong about, and then Enlightenment Now, which is kind of reacting to some of the criticism he got, is basically saying the moral progress of humanity is going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. There might be a few sort of blips here, and obviously Putin and
it's a long haul. It's over the long haul. Yeah.
But would you rather
Shermer calls it the moral arc, right?
Yeah.
Now, the question I want to throw out to you is that is that great because of the hockey stick curve, because of the prosperity? What happens when the bottom falls out and there's economic collapse? What happens then to the moral arc? Does it just go?
Yes, it will, because of human nature. So that's really interesting. The countries with the best human rights are the countries with the best economies. Why is that? Because their economies enable them to pay for welfare states and solid welfare states, especially when so you don't want somewhere like America, in my opinion, where you've got the wealth inequality is so huge. What you want is somewhere like the Nordic states, where you've got the difference between the richest and the poorest is the smallest in the world. And they also have a high tax threshold that enables them to afford a really decent welfare system. So they have existential security. As soon as you've got existential security and good education, you have less religiosity, because you don't need to believe. There's no necessity for the functions that God provides for so many people. Why there's the most the most dangerous nations on earth, the most unsafe nations have the highest religiosity. Okay, so you've got all these things going on. I think
I want to applaud that. That is well said. Now there might be something in that. I'm just going to say that is very well said.
Well, thank you.
I really wish we could graft that on and replicate that. I really, really do.
But where it's relevant to what you were saying is that if the economic bottom fell out of that, so if everyone, and we saw this with COVID, right? So I did a talk on COVID, which is to say that you will find that there could be a case where we are moving down Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and where you are worried about literally your own safety. So if you're worried about these physiological needs at the bottom, then you're not worried about all these things at the top, self-actualization. And also you are less able to afford to look after other people. So when the economic bottom falls out, or when you're threatened with a pandemic, you start thinking about, am I okay? And are my immediate family okay? And I don't really give a crap about people on the other side of the world. And I don't really care about the environmental situation going on and climate change, because heck, we're really threatened with our own existences. Well, if the economic bottom falls out, then you are going to be starting to worry about all these things down here at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And therefore your morality will be all about me and my immediate in-group okay. And
life becomes a giant season of Walking Dead. Yeah,
exactly. And so it's really interesting. I think it's a really interesting area to think about, which is the deep connection between economic stability and economic well-being, or economic success, and moral well-being.
Yeah.
As much as you wouldn't like that to be the case, that is the case in reality. Sorry.
No. All that is brilliant. And I just want to jump in on one thing. It's specifically about Putin. Is the flip side of that is when you have a dictatorship, they seem so impregnable and so unstoppable and so all-powerful, and yet they all seem to fall apart in the same way. They all have those same fatal flaws, because you can't maintain that forever over the long haul. Short haul, you can make things very miserable, but it's very interesting that the further Putin gets away from reality, that he can't really escape that there's some concrete realities that are going to come back on him eventually.
So how much are we to blame for something like North Korea? Belarus, for example, I've heard comparisons of Belarus as being the North Korea of Europe. We've got situations where you have people, even in Ukraine, for refugees to move into Poland. There's a black market of, take something like cigarettes, a $1 or like 1/5 of the value of cigarettes in the two countries. And so there's this black market of moving things back and forth. So it's not as easy as to say, let's just open up the borders and let everybody move into Poland, because you've got, grandmas are willing to, like, hide these in their little old lady dresses in order to smuggle them in so that they can, feed their family. Like,
so
it's like
what you'll have in Poland is again, to link it back to what you're just saying about the hockey stick and the economic reality is if the Polish people start feeling threatened themselves and moving down the hierarchy of needs, so that like we've got 10 million, let's say, just make this absurd, let's say 10 million refugees coming to Poland, and then suddenly I can't afford to get stuff for my family, and now I'm chatting. So then you start getting, it's the linking of, if I'm comfortable, I can be moral. If I'm existentially threatened, then my morality is all about me and mine. And I think, in a perfect world, we all have our own space and everyone's living in these lovely functioning democracies. But when you are threatened, morality is tested.
Yeah.
But as far as what David was saying, how long? The thing is, Putin can only sustain his scenario at the moment as long as he can control the information. It's all about controlling information. Right. If his whole country knows that thousands of people are coming back in body bags, if they can see what's going on outside their borders, if they can access through parts of the internet the reality of the situation, then he loses and he gets deposed. If he can, I think
that's the biggest difference between somebody like Belarus or Russia and North Korea, is that they still have the stranglehold on the country's sense of reality, if you will. And yeah, reality is good for people and bad for dictators in the long run.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, there's also that threat of the button. This is one thing that I'm really, because let's see if we can pull it back to, moral philosophy here for a minute, because it goes to what you were saying, Jonathan, earlier about a utilitarian ethic, which seems to be what's at play, which does make a lot of sense. So we're going to sit here and say, you know what, we're not going to do much in terms, something with teeth. We got economic sanctions, but are we going to really, really do much to get in the way of Putin? I don't know.
Yeah. Because you're exactly right. So the no-fly zone.
Huh?
Yeah, you're exactly right. The no-fly zone, the decision over the no-fly zone is purely consequential. It's a consequentialist decision, which is like, okay, if we institute a no-fly zone, that's like in World War III, 600,000 people might die. If we don't do that, 60,000 Ukrainians might die. We prefer 60,000 than 600,000, so we won't do the no-fly zone. That's exactly, in reality, that's exactly what's happening. And the nuclear thing is, there's going to be a lot of brinkmanship. There's going to be a lot of he's second guessing what he's doing. But at the end of the day, that is the threat that stops us we can go up to a red line, and it's where we really think that red line is. And how Putin imagines that red line is. So if we're just constantly throwing in arms, he's already said that that's akin to us being part of the war through the Western borders. But then, and he then threatens with a nuclear war. Like, do we stop doing that, or do we go on? How far do we? And and with cyber war, how far can we take that before? Yeah. And with economic sanctions, he's saying that's us getting involved. At what point does he actually press that button? How far do we take it? That's politics.
I'm hoping the same thing happens to him. What happened to Nixon during Watergate, where the chief of staff said to the nuclear forces, "Do not let the President Nixon anywhere near the nuclear football." They just completely did a workaround. I really, really hope that's happening on the Russian side right now.
So the point is, it has to come from within. Whether or not he's disposing them, they're just saying, you're not getting access to that. There's too much power.
I'm hoping he goes down exactly like all the Roman generals there, where their palace guard is what takes them out. Wow. And it makes me wonder how many Ukrainians are in the Soviet Secret Service or the Russian,
Secret Service. Say that there is an insider, because he's been warned of assassination attempts 3 times from the inside. But the only way Ukraine wins, is if Putin is deposed either by the public or by his own cabinet. That's the only way, because otherwise he's a narcissist, and he's paranoid, and he's a conspiracy theorist, and he's all those things, and he has to win, or he's to come out of this saving face. And the only way he can save face, he can't win this. The only way he wins it is by flattening Ukraine. So it's either the death of a shed load of Ukrainians or he gets deposed.
And if he's willing to flatten Ukrainian, what else will he be unwilling to flatten? It's like I don't want to start saying that we're at the edge of nuclear Armageddon, because I don't think so. I think his brinkmanship is just that. He's just another tool he uses. But
I think the only other place. So I did a YouTube on this the other night, and I said, he won't attack anywhere else. He'll stop there. It's just suicide for him to go anywhere else. But actually, I wasn't thinking straight, because Moldova is not a member of the EU, and it's not a member of NATO. And there's Transnistria, which is a part of Moldova, which has Russian bases in and is contested. And so actually, if he was to go anywhere, he'll walk straight into Moldova. So if I was Moldovan, I'd be pretty worried at the moment.
I totally concur.
Yeah, there was. Go ahead, David.
Well, just one on the flip side, it's interesting that things are not always going the way he wanted, because Finland, a couple of years ago, 19% of the population wanted to join NATO. Now it's 53%. So things that where he was counting on are not going his way.
Everything he would have wanted out of this, he has lost. And in fact, he hasn't lost; it's gone the other way. So the EU has got stronger. This is united EU more than anything else would have had. And I think, is Georgia want to join the EU now? Ukraine wants to join the EU, and I think even Moldova wants to join the EU. And then you've got NATO. You've got Sweden and Finland now want to join NATO. These two things he's so worried about now they are now stronger and more unified than they ever would have been had this not happened. So,
and as we pointed out before, there's so many Russians in jail right now because they are not afraid to speak out against Putin, which blows my mind. Yeah. I'm so knocked out by the courage that the Russian people are showing.
And that'll be overlooked in a way, right? Because how do you sympathize with the Russian soldiers, with the people from within that are trying to reform? What's going to happen to the Russian people post Putin? It's war is such a horrific situation. Are you guys aware of anybody that's there's definitely Putin sympathizers, but imagine Putin's gone. Is there anybody carrying the torch that you're aware of
No, and I think
the war front, right? If he's gone, is it literally this offensive is done, or are there?
That's what I think. /hope. That's what I think. /hope. But
I think there's a worry that there aren't really people to either way. Actually, I don't. So one analysis I've heard is that actually it's quite different from Soviet era Russia, where you had the Politburo and you had quite a big political apparatus at work. Yeah. Putin has become such an authoritarian leader, and he's removed himself post-COVID physically he's in his own sort of palace, and he's got a very small number of people around him. So his advisors are small in number. And so you've got a real concentration of power. That means that actually, if Putin was assassinated or deposed, there is no one else really. And I think you'd be open to just a complete reform, possibly, or I don't know. I think there's an interesting sort of observation in that.
It is hard to imagine they could possibly get worse, but it could get. All great changes are preceded by chaos. I can think that's certainly.
Yeah. I mean, it's just it's nothing's good at the moment, really.
Right.
There's pain. As I say, even if Ukraine comes out winning, you're going to have a lot of deaths in order for that to happen. Because in order for Putin to get deposed, either by a coup or by his own people, he would have to suffer pretty catastrophic losses, and the economic sanctions, which are going to have to be pretty catastrophic as well, in order for people to reach that tipping point.
Yeah, well said. What's your guys' time like? Do you want to do a wrap, you guys, and call it a day?
Yep, it's your call. Yep.
I think so. I think it was
we covered a lot of ground today. Yeah.
Yeah, we did. Okay. Well, Jonathan, I want to welcome you back. I don't know if it'll be as soon as, for anybody listening, I don't know if it's going to be as soon as next episode, but I think, Jonathan, you're always welcome to pop in. And David, as always, thank you. I want to, thank you on behalf of the listeners, and we want to thank the listeners for tuning in, and we want your continue to support, and just great to get everybody together. And until next time, David, say your sign off, and Jonathan, thanks for coming and little words, and that's bye for me.
And I've forgotten what my sign off is, so that's it for the myth of Jesus with Dave Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I love, as you can tell, I love talking about pretty much anything. So we went from the myth of Jesus to Putin, just like that. Like that, with some amazing segues in there, I'm sure. But thank you for the opportunity.
Great, guys. Thank you.
Good night, all.
Bye.
The Myth of Jesus with David Fitzgerald.